everyone. I'm Eriko Kojima.
And I'm Taka Furukawa. Today we are going on a journey over the last 100 years of Japan's development.
What does it mean to be a Japanese man or a Japanese woman? We'll be looking at 100 years of Japan's social development to answer this question.
This will help us understand more about Japan and about how the nation developed.
And it will show some of the problems we need to watch out for in development.
It's been over a century since Japan joined the international community and started modernizing.
100 years ago, most people in Japan were poor farmers.
How did society change in that period? In particular, what happened to the roles of men and women?
A century seems a very long time. To make things easier, we're going to divide it into 3 periods.
First, in the period from 1900 to 1945, Japan modernized itself and worked to increase its wealth and military power.
But at the end of the Second World War, the country and its economy was in chaos. The second period covers Reconstruction and the years of high economic growth that followed.
And finally, from the early 1990s to the present, Japan has been in a period of low growth. This began after the end of the bubble economy and the Asian economic crisis.
First of all, let's take a look at the position of Japanese men in society during those 3 periods.
From 1900 to 1945 was a period of modernization. Japan's wealth and military power increased.
In 1842, China, Japan's close neighbor and a major power, was defeated by Great Britain. China was forced to submit to the demands of the European powers. In Japan, people saw that and realized that they too were vulnerable.
They decided to create a modern, powerful nation centered on the emperor. Western culture was introduced, and Japan began a journey of modernization.
These national objectives were supported by the structure of the Japanese family. The man at the head of the household had complete authority.
Generally, the eldest son became the head of the household.
Meanwhile, his wife's position was weak. We'll look at that more closely later. Public education guided men and women in different ways. Boys had advantages over girls in both education and health.
Also, only men could be involved in politics. At first, only wealthy men could vote. Then, from 1925, all men could vote. Women could not vote. Japanese men at this time were expected to be very loyal soldiers. They could be ordered to join the military at any time. They had to leave their families behind. And they were ordered to fight against other countries in wars from 1894 to 1945.
This was a period of colonial expansion and war. 2 concepts were very strong for Japanese men. We must be strong to dominate other countries, and a soldier's life belongs to his country first, before his family or himself. By the end of the Second World War, the average life expectancy for Japanese males was only 23.9 years.
At this time, approximately 60% of Japanese made a living through farming or fishing.
Most were small farmers on the edge of poverty.
The men also worked as laborers to earn extra money. They built roads and railways, sometimes far away from homes. They also worked in mines and factories, but this work was badly paid.
Japan's industrial development during this period depended on cheap village labor. there was an enormous gap between rich and poor.
During this period, it was said that people's capabilities opened the path to success and social advancement. But actually, Japan was still a developing nation, and most people were still poor farmers. Very few men escaped from poverty and achieved success. After the Second World War, the Allied occupation forces began to democratize and demilitarize Japan. There were radical changes. These included putting the people first and introducing equality between men and women.
From the late 1950s to the end of the 1970s, Japan experienced a miraculous recovery and rapid economic growth. Many companies that succeeded during this period are now very famous. Companies like Toyota, Honda, and Panasonic.
Men were no longer forced to become soldiers. However, they were expected to work incredibly hard as economic soldiers or corporate warriors. An ideal worker would work from early morning to late at night and come into the office at the weekend.
He would leave family matters to his wife and devote himself completely to his company. In return, men received enough money to look after their families, and their job was safe until retirement age. Because of Japan's economic success, companies were able to look after their workers well.
Men were taught and believed that sacrificing their lives for the company was their purpose in life.
Unlike before the war, boys no longer dominated girls in education and health. But men were still expected to be the main provider for the family. The focus in a family was on the education of the boys. It was hoped that they would enter a good school. This was the key to joining a good company or organization.
The old family system was abolished, and extended households were gradually replaced by nuclear families, just parents and children. Men no longer had total authority at home.
But they were still very dominant because they were the main economic provider. A woman's role at the time was to support the corporate warrior by working as a full-time homemaker. Women had no economic power. They were expected to focus on providing a family and raising future corporate warriors.
The father's good salary made it possible to buy modern household appliances and a car. They could live in a decent home in the suburbs and pay for the children's university education. A man was no longer the terrifying master of the household with absolute power.
However, when there was an argument with a rebellious teenager or a wife who wanted a job outside the home, a typical man of the period would shout, "Who puts food on this family's table?"
Japan's economic growth came to an end in the early 90s when the bubble economy burst. Company after company began to reduce the number of workers. Men with high wages were a heavy burden for companies.
Unemployed men lost their sense of identity, and some men were not able to tell their wives that they had lost their job. Instead, they would lie. They would pretend to go to work, but then spend the day wandering around the park. Then they would return home in the evening.
Meanwhile, more suicides were caused by financial hardship or career problems. Each year, more than 17,000 men over 40 commit suicide. Many men are still employed, but they are not secure. As the number of employees decreases, more and more temporary employees are hired. The burden on the remaining regular male employees continues to increase. Overtime work pays less and less. About half of the fathers in Tokyo cannot return home before 9 at night. There is now growing concern about more and more deaths and suicides caused by overwork.
Men who worked until their retirement age don't know what to do when they do retire.
A wife may have felt neglected during her husband's working years, and she may ask for a divorce. A middle-aged man may be treated simply as a source of cash by his children. Middle-aged men have trouble finding a role to play in the home. As a result, more and more Japanese men are questioning traditional male roles and searching for new ways to be themselves. It's clear that there have been enormous changes for Japanese men over the last 100 years.
It has been tough for men, but women have also struggled. They have been trying to achieve equality with men. Next, we look at the changes a century has brought to Japanese women. During the period of modernization and increasing military power, the only roles available to women were very different from those for men. They were seen as below men. They were expected to be good wives and mothers, devoted to the family.
And yet, they did not have the basic rights of citizenship.
A woman always held a lower position than a man in the household. The husband ranked above the wife. The father ranked above the mother. The oldest son and heir had a higher position than his mother. A son was considered superior to a daughter. A wife had no financial independence and no property rights. She was considered legally incompetent in a similar position to a child.
After marriage, the wife was required to join her husband's family and take her husband's name.
As the heir had to be male, a woman's most important role was to bear a son. Girls were educated in a completely different system from boys. Their education was designed by the state. The aim was to produce good wives and mothers.
And poor girls in overpopulated agricultural regions had no time for even a basic education.
In rural areas, women had to perform the same heavy labor as men.
At the same time, they had to do the housework and endure a constant cycle of pregnancy and child rearing. Insufficient rest and nutrition led to a high mortality rate among women and children in rural areas. 161 out of 1,000 children under 5 died.
But poverty was not the only cause. The woman would work the hardest and eat the least. The male-centered culture didn't think much about the health of the mother. In order to survive poverty, young girls in poor farming families were often sent to work as nursing maids and housemaids for wealthy families, or they were sent to work in textile factories. Female factory workers earned low wages and often worked under bad conditions until they collapsed from illness. To pay off small debts owed by their parents, many young women were sold into prostitution in Japan or even overseas.
These poor village women made yarn, silk, and cotton for the textile industry. This drove Japan's modernization.
3.1 million Japanese died in the Second World War. The average life expectancy for a Japanese woman at this time was 37.5. Although that is 13 years longer than the average life of the soldiers who went to war, it is still very short. Democratization after the war was good news for women. The occupation forces included a guarantee of gender equality in the new constitution. Women became citizens and were given an equal position with men under the law. The education system was open equally to men and women. Women could now receive an education that developed their personal abilities. They could do more than prepare for the role of a good wife and mother. Women had equal political rights, and female politicians began to appear. What happened to the women in rural villages? Remember, life for these women was terrible before the Second World War. After the war, the government introduced programs to improve living standards in rural areas. Young wives were in very weak position in the old system, but now they played a leading role in rural development.
This brought great changes. Before, young women were always told not to have their own ideas. Now, they were encouraged to think, to identify problems, and to solve the problems.
As a result, living standards in rural communities greatly improved. Women were no longer obedient laborers. Since then, rural women in Japan have been the main actors driving agriculture and rural development. Public health and mother and child welfare systems were greatly improved. Women's lives had been short. They had many babies, but mortality rates were very high for both mothers and children. Now, women began to live longer and give birth less often. Mortality rates fell dramatically. The average life expectancy for Japanese women today is 85, one of the longest in the world.
But in a society experiencing fierce economic growth, women faced new challenges.
During the period of high economic growth, Japanese women were expected to support corporate warriors. They were expected to become full-time homemakers who did housework and raised children.
Educated women who wished to continue working beyond a certain age were not welcome in the workplace. Even if their career was long, they would still earn far less than men with the same experience. Younger men overtook them in both rank and salary.
Social policies, such as the taxation and pension systems, were based on a family model. A woman was expected to be a full-time homemaker with a wage-earning husband. The pension system favored women who were full-time homemakers over those who continued working.
The nuclear family, consisting of parents and children, was taking shape. The husband always put work first. The wife managed the household accounts.
A man's income and position rose steadily as he got older. But the financial burden of the mortgage and the cost of the children's education was heavy. After the children reached a certain age, women went out to work to help the family finances.
However, they only worked part-time. it was still seen as important to maintain a comfortable family life for the corporate warrior husband. For companies, cheap female labor was welcome. It helped to balance the company's finances.
Japan's economy grew steadily during the post-war period until 1990. Then Japan entered its first economic downturn, which lasted for over 10 years. Economic growth based on manufacturing ended. A less overheated period began with a new focus on service industries. Jobs in manufacturing were no longer only for men. More women were entering the workforce with better education and qualifications. The Equal Employment Act, together with child and family care measures, encouraged more women to continue to work after marriage and childbirth. Women now follow careers traditionally associated with men, such as medicine, science, journalism, transport, and construction. Female entrepreneurs were also becoming common.
The public has welcomed new welfare and nursing services and other community development activities and businesses.
However, Japanese men remain workaholics and still think of themselves as corporate warriors. As a result, women still have to cope with housework and child-rearing. Caring for elderly parents is also considered a woman's job.
Many urban nuclear families have little communication with and help from relatives or the local community. The reality is still unfavorable for women. They bear the burden of running the household alone.
Japanese society is now facing a new problem. The birth rate is very low and continues to fall. In 2006, the average number of children a woman would have in her lifetime fell to 1.3.
In Japan's current stagnant economy, men are either forced out of jobs or must accept low wages. They can no longer be sure to have the secure position and economic power of the family breadwinner.
Working women considering marriage must still face a conventional either-or choice, either career or children. As a result, marriage has become more difficult for many young men and women.
The fall in birth rate is a serious threat to Japanese society. The working population may become too small to support the pension system. Japanese society is currently seeking solutions to this crisis.
We can see one clear factor that makes it difficult to create a better society: rigid ideas about male and female roles and identities. Men and women must free themselves from gender stereotypes. Each person needs to be free to choose the best way to let their personal capabilities shine.
We have completed a quick overview of Japan's development over the last 100 years. Let's take a few minutes to review the major issues again.
At first, Japan was eager for national development. Japan built a society, economy, and culture where gender completely defined a person's role and social position. Men had absolute dominance, and there was great inequality between men and women.
During the next period of change, men took on the glamorous role of corporate warriors. Women supported them in the background.
But today, men face an unpleasant reality. They worry about death through overwork. They have no place in the home or local community because they are focused on being corporate warriors.
Women were once seen almost as male positions. How have things changed? Society is still dominated by men. To have a family and also a career in this society still puts a heavy strain on women. But Japanese women are making great progress. In that sense, the future looks healthier and brighter for women than for men in Japan.
We have shown you the reality in Japan, an economic superpower. What do you think? Are you working to help your nation develop? Japan's economy grew powerfully, but other problems were created at the same time. Throughout the history of every society, one key to development has been to reform the relationship between men and women.
It's difficult to change traditional views about gender. We hope that this example of how Japan changed over the years has given you something to think about. It is always a good idea to consider your development plans from the viewpoint of women and the viewpoint of men. That will guide you to development, offering a better future for both the men and women in your society.
We look forward to seeing you again one day.
Goodbye.
Hello.
Gender, male and female roles in society. This is a vital factor in any development planning.
And now, a popular, easy-to-use CD-ROM is available. Everything you need to know in 30 minutes. Understanding gender and its role in development.
It's available free of charge to anyone who needs it.
We look forward to hearing from you.